Here's a question worth sitting with before anything else in this video, because the honest answer is going to change how you think about global trade for the rest of your life. How can the entire global economy, trillions of dollars, billions of people, nearly everything you personally own, hang on 5 specific stretches of water, each one narrow enough that a single ship, turned sideways by nothing more than an unlucky gust of wind, can shut one of them down completely for days at a time? In March 2021, a container ship called the Ever Given, longer than the Empire State Building is tall and carrying roughly 20,000 containers, got caught by a sudden gust of wind while transiting the Suez Canal, spun sideways in the narrow channel, and wedged itself diagonally across the entire waterway, its bow and stern both buried in the canal's banks. For 6 full days, nothing could pass in either direction. Behind it, a line of more than 360 vessels stacked up at both ends of the canal, waiting, their cargo simply frozen in place with nowhere to go. Analysts estimated the blockage was holding up something in the neighborhood of $9.6 billion in trade. For every single day the canal remained closed, a figure that, however imprecise any single estimate inevitably is, captures the genuine scale of what one grounded ship had managed to do to the global economy. One ship, one gust of wind, $9.6 billion a day. Here's the question this video is actually going to answer. If the global economy is supposed to be vast, redundant, and practically unstoppable, the way it's usually described in the news, in economics textbooks, in the confident language of globalization itself, how does one poorly steered ship bring a meaningful fraction of it to a complete 6-day halt? The uncomfortable answer is that the modern trade system isn't nearly as distributed or as resilient as it appears from a distance or on a standard shipping map covered in crisscrossing lines. Almost everything that crosses an ocean passes through one of just 5 narrow gates, and every single one of those 5 gates can be pinched shut. By an accident, by a drought, by a drone, by a state simply flexing its geographic position, with no fast, cheap way around it waiting in reserve. This is the story of those 5 places, why they matter more than almost anyone realizes until something goes wrong at one of them, and what it actually means that the entire modern global economy quietly balances every single day on 5 very narrow, largely irreplaceable pins. To understand why one blocked canal can shake the entire global economy, you first have to understand just how much of that economy actually depends on the ocean in the first place. According to the United Nations Trade and Development Agency, over 80% of everything traded internationally by volume travels by sea. Not by air, which remains far too expensive for the vast majority of physical goods, despite how often air freight gets discussed in the news. Not by truck or train crossing a land border, which only ever connects a limited number of neighboring economies in the first place. By ship. Container ships carrying electronics, furniture, and clothing. Bulk carriers hauling grain, coal, and iron ore. Tankers moving crude oil and liquefied natural gas across entire oceans. The device you're watching this video on right now almost certainly spent weeks of its existence sealed inside a steel shipping container, floating slowly across an ocean, long before it ever reached whatever store or warehouse eventually delivered it to you. Look at a standard map of global shipping routes, and the picture looks genuinely reassuring at first glance, almost deliberately so. Lines crisscross every ocean on the planet, connecting seemingly every port on Earth to every other port. In a dense, tangled web that looks, on the surface, exactly like the kind of redundant, decentralized system that should be nearly impossible to seriously disrupt no matter what goes wrong at any single point along the way. If one route has a problem, the intuitive assumption goes, surely 100 others can absorb the difference without much trouble. That's the natural, comforting assumption almost everyone carries into this topic without ever really examining it closely. And it's the exact assumption this entire video is going to spend the next several minutes taking apart, piece by piece, using nothing but publicly available shipping data. Shipping companies themselves, along with the insurers who price the risk of every voyage, the freight brokers who negotiate rates daily, and the professional analysts who track global trade patterns for a living, don't actually see the ocean the way that reassuring, deceptively busy-looking map suggests to a casual observer. They see it divided, in practice, into a small number of genuinely critical corridors, each one carrying a share of global trade wildly disproportionate to its actual, modest physical size on any standard map. Everything else, all those thinner crisscrossing lines connecting smaller regional ports to each other, matters considerably less to the overall structural functioning of the global economy than the 5 specific places this video is about to walk through, in careful, documented detail, one at a time. That distinction between what a map visually suggests and what the underlying trade data actually shows is worth holding on to for the rest of this video, because it's the exact gap this entire story lives inside. Because if you look more closely at that same map, something becomes obvious the moment you actually know to look for it. Those lines don't spread evenly across the ocean's surface the way a genuinely redundant network would. They bend, funnel, and converge again and again toward a small handful of narrow physical passages, places where the raw geography of continents and coastlines leaves ships no real alternative but to squeeze through a channel sometimes only a few miles wide at its tightest point. A ship traveling from the Persian Gulf toward Europe doesn't actually have a dozen equally convenient paths to choose between, whatever the tangle of lines on a map might suggest at a glance. It has essentially one route that makes any economic sense at all, and that single route runs through a specific stretch of water barely wide enough for 2 fully loaded supertankers to safely pass each other going in opposite directions. That's the plant this video is setting deliberately, early on, because it's the specific detail the rest of this story depends on entirely from this point forward. The global trade map isn't actually the wide, genuinely redundant web it appears to be at a casual glance from a distance. It's a system that funnels an enormous, disproportionate share of the world's physical goods through just 5 narrow doorways scattered across the entire planet. And the moment any single one of those doorways gets even partially blocked, for any reason at all, there is no quick, cheap detour conveniently waiting on the other side of the map, ready to absorb the difference. There's only a much longer, much more expensive path routed entirely around an intervening continent, or in some cases, no genuinely viable path at all within any reasonable cost or time frame. Keep that specific image in mind as this video moves through each of the 5 choke points individually, one at a time. A funnel, not a web. A handful of unavoidable doorways, not a redundant network of interchangeable options. That single distinction is the entire reason a single grounded ship, a single drought, or a single armed group with a handful of drones can meaningfully disrupt an economy worth many trillions of dollars. Let's start with the 2 busiest of these 5 doorways, because the numbers alone should reset how you think about global trade entirely. The Strait of Malacca runs between Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea, and from there to the entire manufacturing engine of East Asia, narrowing at its tightest point to barely 1.5 miles across, dense with tanker and container traffic moving in both directions simultaneously, day and night, without pause. Singapore, sitting almost exactly at the strait's eastern mouth, has built one of the busiest, most sophisticated port complexes on Earth precisely because of this single geographic accident. turning its position at the edge of this narrow passage into one of the most successful economic strategies of the 20th century. According to data compiled by the U.S. Energy Information Administration for the first half of 2025, roughly 23.2 million barrels of oil per day move through this single strait, accounting for close to 29% of all global maritime petroleum flows combined. Here's the detail that tends to genuinely surprise people the first time they hear it. The kind of expectation-breaking fact worth sitting with for a second before moving on. Malacca moves more oil every single day of the year than the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point most people actually associate reflexively with global oil anxiety whenever tensions rise in the Middle East. Most of that oil moving through Malacca is headed toward China, Japan, South Korea, and the rest of industrial East Asia, the manufacturing engine currently producing an enormous share of everything sold anywhere on Earth, from smartphones to solar panels. The Strait of Hormuz, sitting between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, is considerably narrower than Malacca, more heavily discussed in Western news coverage, and strategically concentrated in a somewhat different way. Roughly 20.9 million barrels of oil pass through Hormuz daily, representing close to a fifth of the entire world's liquid petroleum supply, and, by some measures, close to a full quarter of all oil that moves by sea globally at any given moment. It also carries a substantial share of the world's liquefied natural gas trade, over 11 billion cubic feet a day, more than a fifth of the entire global total moving through this one specific channel. The tensions surrounding this particular strait have been well documented across multiple decades, recurring diplomatic disputes between regional powers, periodic naval standoffs involving multiple countries' military vessels, and repeated public warnings from regional governments about their capacity to restrict traffic through it if a broader conflict ever demanded that response. It's worth being genuinely precise here, because it matters considerably for understanding the actual level of risk correctly rather than reflexively. Despite decades of recurring tension, periodic crisis, and no shortage of alarming headlines, Hormuz has never, historically, experienced a prolonged, total closure lasting more than a brief period. The threat itself, real and consequential as it undeniably is, has functioned quite differently in practice than an actual sustained blockage would, shaping insurance costs and shipping behavior more than it has ever actually stopped oil from moving. Then there's Suez, the choke point that opened this entire video. The Suez Canal, connecting the Mediterranean Sea directly to the Red Sea, has functioned as the primary shortcut between Europe and Asia since it first opened to commercial traffic on November 17, 1869, after roughly a decade of construction, eliminating the need for ships to sail all the way around the entire southern tip of the African continent, a detour that could otherwise add weeks to a single voyage. In an ordinary year, before the disruptions this video will describe shortly, the canal carried somewhere in the neighborhood of 12% of all global trade passing through its narrow, entirely artificial channel, a channel that itself took roughly a decade to dig by hand and machine. At a staggering human cost, historians still debate the exact scale of today. The 2021 Ever Given incident, the one that opened this entire video, demonstrated just how completely a single physical obstruction, lasting only 6 days from start to finish, could ripple outward into a $9.6 billion a day disruption to global commerce. A widely cited estimate, worth flagging honestly as an estimate rather than an official, independently audited figure, but one that captures the genuine scale of what happened regardless of its exact statistical precision. Egypt itself, which operates and profits directly from canal transit fees charged to every single vessel that passes through, regardless of flag or cargo type, was separately estimated to be losing something in the range of $15 million a day in direct canal revenue alone. For every single day, the blockage continued. on top of the much larger, harder to measure ripple effects hitting shipping companies, insurers, and retailers waiting anxiously on delayed cargo thousands of miles away from Egypt itself. Container ships carrying everything from furniture to auto parts to seasonal retail goods sat completely motionless for nearly a full week, their contents worth billions of dollars collectively, while a single grounded vessel blocked the only genuinely practical maritime route connecting two of the largest economic zones on the entire planet. Refloating the ship itself required a coordinated effort involving multiple tugboats, dredging equipment working around the clock, and a fortunate high tide, a reminder of just how much physical, almost old-fashioned effort it took to free a single stuck vessel large enough to single-handedly freeze a meaningful share of global trade. The fourth choke point sits just south of Suez, at the narrow mouth of the Red Sea, and it illustrates something the first three choke points in this video don't. What actually happens when a choke point's threat stops being a theoretical, historical possibility and becomes an active, ongoing, day-to-day reality shaping global shipping decisions. The Bab-el-Mandeb Strait, separating Yemen on the Arabian Peninsula from the Horn of Africa on the opposite shore, functions as the essential gateway any ship must pass through to reach the Suez Canal from the Indian Ocean side, carrying roughly 4.2 million barrels of oil daily, along with an enormous volume of container traffic moving between Asian factories and European markets. Since November 2023, this specific strait has been the site of repeated, sustained attacks on commercial shipping vessels, claimed by Houthi forces operating out of Yemen, one of the poorest countries in the region, which had already been engaged in its own long-running internal civil conflict for the better part of a decade before these shipping attacks began. The basic facts here, stated as plainly and as neutrally as this video is able to state them. Multiple commercial vessels have been struck by missiles and drones over the following 2 years. Several have been seriously damaged or sunk entirely, and the campaign has been publicly described by those carrying it out as directly connected to the broader, ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. This video isn't going to analyze the merits, origins, or broader morality of that separate regional conflict, and it isn't going to attribute any of these specific actions to the Yemeni people as a whole, to Arabs generally, or to any religious or ethnic group whatsoever. These are documented military and paramilitary actions attributed specifically to one identified armed group, not a description or characterization of any broader population, nation, or faith. The distinction matters enormously for accurately understanding this specific choke point, because collapsing a specific group's stated military campaign into a broader statement about an entire people or region would be both factually inaccurate and needlessly unfair to millions of ordinary civilians who have no connection whatsoever to these specific attacks. The practical effect on global shipping has been enormous, sustained, and, as of this recording, still genuinely unresolved. Major shipping lines redirected the overwhelming majority of their vessels away from the Red Sea entirely, sending them instead on a much longer path around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, a diversion that adds roughly 6,000 miles to a voyage, and, depending on the specific route involved, an additional week to 10 days of travel time, sometimes stretching a total Asia to Europe voyage past 40 full days at sea. Even during periods of reduced attacks, shipping volumes through Suez have remained sharply below pre-crisis levels for an extended stretch of time, with container traffic specifically down by a wide margin compared to before the crisis began, since container carriers in particular have been the slowest and most cautious to return to the shorter route. This situation has continued shifting back and forth over the past 2 years, with brief periods of apparent calm repeatedly followed by renewed disruption, and its current status at the exact moment you happen to be watching this video is genuinely worth checking independently, rather than assuming it still matches whatever snapshot this video is describing. The fifth and final choke point in this story operates through an entirely different mechanism than the previous four, and it's the one that proves conclusively that this isn't purely a story about ships, armed conflict, and geopolitics. The Panama Canal, opened on August 15, 1914, after roughly a decade of American-led construction, connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through an elaborate system of locks that depend, absolutely critically, on a steady supply of fresh water from an artificial lake to actually operate at all, since each transit through the locks requires releasing millions of gallons of fresh water out to sea. In a normal year, the canal handles somewhere between 34 and 36 vessel transits a day. But beginning in late 2023, a severe, sustained drought dropped the level of Gatun Lake, the canal's essential water source, to its lowest recorded point since 1965, forcing canal authorities to sharply restrict the number of daily transits, at points down to roughly 24 ships a day, extending wait times from days into weeks and pushing shipping costs upward across the industry for the better part of a year. The canal gradually recovered as regular rainfall eventually returned to the region, climbing back toward roughly 35 transits a day by August 2024. This particular choke point's vulnerability has nothing whatsoever to do with geopolitics, military threats, or any armed group's intentions. It comes down entirely to rainfall, a purely climatic constraint on a piece of century-old infrastructure the global economy has quietly come to depend on, as though it were permanent, unshakable, and immune to the weather. Here is the turn this entire video has been building toward from its opening seconds, and it's worth stating plainly, because it's genuinely the single most important idea in this whole story. None of these 5 choke points has a fast, cheap alternative waiting quietly on standby, ready to absorb traffic the moment something goes wrong. That absence of any real backup option, far more than any single individual threat facing any one of these places, is what actually makes this entire system so structurally fragile underneath its confident, globalized surface. Go back to the assumption most people carry into any conversation about global trade, whether or not they've ever consciously articulated it, that a system this large, this valuable, this deeply embedded into the daily functioning of the modern economy must surely have been built with real structural redundancy, multiple genuinely viable paths designed specifically so that no single point of failure could ever meaningfully disrupt the whole. The 5 choke points this video has just walked through, one at a time, demonstrate exactly why that comfortable assumption simply doesn't hold up under scrutiny. When ships avoid the Red Sea entirely, the only real alternative available to them is sailing all the way around the African continent, adding weeks to a single voyage, and by most industry estimates, several $billion in additional fuel and shipping costs across the global fleet collectively, month after month. There is no second Suez Canal sitting half-built somewhere nearby, ready to absorb the overflow traffic the moment the first one becomes unreliable or blocked. When the Panama Canal's water levels drop during a drought, there is no second Panama Canal either, waiting patiently in reserve. The only serious alternative is routing entirely around the southern tip of South America, past the notoriously dangerous waters of Cape Horn, a detour so long, so weather dangerous, and so expensive in both fuel and insurance costs that it's rarely treated as a realistic option for the overwhelming majority of commercial cargo at all. Engineers have occasionally floated proposals for entirely new canal projects elsewhere in Central America, most notably a long-discussed and repeatedly abandoned plan for a canal through Nicaragua. But none of these proposals has ever advanced past preliminary studies and stalled financing, precisely because building genuine redundancy for a choke point, this specific and this expensive, turns out to be far harder in practice than simply identifying the theoretical need for one on a map. This is the genuinely uncomfortable part of the story. the part worth sitting with longer than any single statistic. The threats facing these 5 choke points haven't stayed the same kind of threat over time, the way earlier generations of planners might have reasonably assumed they would. They've diversified considerably in ways that make the overall system meaningfully harder to defend against as a whole, rather than easier. A single accident, like the Ever Given, can close an entire canal through nothing more dramatic than an unlucky gust of wind and a moment of human error. A multi-year drought, driven by shifting climate patterns nobody fully controls, can quietly strangle a canal's operating capacity for the better part of a year without a single hostile actor involved anywhere in the story. A non-state armed group, equipped with relatively cheap drones and missiles rather than any conventional navy, can now impose real, sustained economic costs on global shipping through a strait that no single nation's military fully controls or can fully secure. And a state actor, simply by making credible threats backed by a genuine, visible military presence nearby, can reshape global shipping behavior and insurance pricing without ever actually firing a single shot. Exactly the way recurring tensions around the Strait of Hormuz have repeatedly demonstrated across multiple separate decades. 4 fundamentally different kinds of threats: mechanical accident, shifting climate patterns, non-state armed conflict, and deliberate state-level deterrence, all converging on the exact same 5 narrow points on the map at precisely the moment global trade volume has reached genuine record highs across nearly every category of cargo. That specific combination is what makes this particular moment in history meaningfully different from earlier decades, when these same 5 choke points already existed geographically, but carried considerably less absolute cargo volume through them, and faced fewer simultaneous, unrelated categories of risk operating all at once. The system as a whole isn't necessarily more dangerous today, because any single one of these threats has gotten dramatically worse in isolation. It's more fragile overall because it's now balancing genuine record-breaking trade volume on the exact same 5 narrow, structurally irreplaceable pins it always has, while simultaneously facing a wider variety of distinct ways. Those 5 pins can be disrupted at once than at any prior point in the modern history of global shipping. So here's what this actually means. Once you put all 5 choke points together, side by side, and step back far enough from the individual details of any single one of them to see the shape of the whole pattern connecting all 5 at once, the way this video has been building toward from its opening minute. Whoever can credibly threaten even one of these 5 gates, even briefly and even without any genuine intention of following through on that threat indefinitely, holds leverage that extends far beyond that single strait or canal alone. When Yemen's Houthi forces began targeting commercial shipping in the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait, the consequences didn't stay contained to that one narrow stretch of water anywhere near Yemen's own coastline. They rippled outward across the entire global shipping network, reshaping shipping routes across the whole Asia to Europe trade lane, driving up insurance costs for vessels that never came anywhere near the actual conflict, and adding weeks of transit time to a meaningful share of the world's total container traffic, month after month. When a severe drought lowered water levels in a single artificial lake in Panama, thousands of miles from any ocean shipping lane in a conventional sense, the consequences still reached container ships and bulk carriers operating an entire hemisphere away, rerouting cargo that had never previously needed to consider any serious alternative to that one specific canal. A disruption at any single one of these 5 points doesn't stay contained locally, the way a purely regional problem normally would. It reaches directly into supply chains, insurance markets, and consumer prices on the completely opposite side of the planet, because the entire global trade system was simply never actually built with enough genuine structural redundancy to absorb the sudden loss of even one of its 5 most critical gates. That's the actual mechanism behind this video's central claim, stated as precisely and carefully as this particular story allows. The global economy feels vast, distributed, and essentially unstoppable. In much the same way the ocean itself feels vast, endless, and impossible to meaningfully constrain from a distance. But almost everything you personally own that ever crossed an ocean to reach you passed through one of just 5 narrow gates to get there. And every single one of those 5 gates can be pinched shut, at least partially and at least temporarily, by forces that have absolutely nothing to do with each other. An accident, a drought, an armed group with a handful of drones, or a state simply demonstrating, without firing a shot, that it could close the gate whenever it chose to. None of this means catastrophic global conflict or a permanent breakdown of world trade is somehow inevitable. And this video isn't going to end its analysis by making that dramatic, headline-friendly claim on your behalf without genuine evidence to support it. What it does mean, and what 5 separate, well-documented, carefully sourced cases across 5 genuinely different choke points have just demonstrated in detail, is that the physical geography of a small handful of narrow waterways has quietly become one of the most consequential, least appreciated forms of leverage in the entire global economy. Leverage that doesn't require conquering anything, doesn't require winning any war outright, and doesn't require controlling more than a few miles of water sitting at exactly the right place on the map. That's a genuinely strange kind of power to hold. Unlike almost any other form of geopolitical leverage discussed in the news, precisely because it requires so little in absolute terms and yields so much in practice. If you've made it this far with me, thank you. Genuinely. This is exactly the kind of story I built this channel to tell. Not the 5-minute headline version of one dramatically blocked canal, the kind that dominates a single news cycle and then fades from memory, but the slower, more deliberate one, where you actually see the underlying pattern connecting 5 separate places most people have only ever heard about individually, one crisis at a time, without ever realizing they're all variations on exactly the same underlying structural vulnerability. If that's what you're after, consider subscribing and joining us. We do this every single day. All right, back to it, because there's still more of this story worth telling before we let you go. Because there's a genuinely fair question worth sitting with carefully, one that naturally follows everything this video has just walked through across 5 separate choke points before we close this particular video out for good. If these 5 choke points are this consequential to the entire global economy, why hasn't the world simply built its way out of the problem by now, engineering redundant alternatives wherever the money and the will exist to do so? The honest answer is that geography, in the overwhelming majority of these specific cases, simply doesn't offer a comparably efficient alternative anywhere nearby to actually build. There's no second isthmus conveniently positioned somewhere else in Central America to host a genuine rival to the Panama Canal. There's no second narrow strait sitting conveniently unused near the Arabian Peninsula, waiting patiently to relieve pressure on Hormuz whenever it's needed. The entire reason these 5 specific places function as choke points in the first place is that they represent genuine, geologically irreplaceable bottlenecks carved by millions of years of continental drift and erosion, not simply underinvested infrastructure that enough money could eventually duplicate somewhere more convenient. That underlying scarcity, more than anything else discussed in this video, is exactly what gives each of these 5 narrow places its wildly outsized leverage over a global economy many thousands of times larger than the narrow strip of water actually controlling it. And that's precisely the thread worth pulling on next in this series, once you've absorbed the full pattern connecting all 5 of these places at once. Because this video has deliberately walked through all 5 choke points in fairly general terms, tracing the underlying pattern that connects them rather than dwelling too long on any single one. But each one of these 5 specific places has its own deeper, considerably stranger history, its own particular moment when a regional power first realized exactly what kind of leverage it happened to be sitting on, and its own specific answer to the same underlying question. This entire video has been circling around from its opening seconds. What actually happens to the rest of the world when the country controlling a few miles of water finally decides, for whatever reason, to use that leverage on purpose, rather than simply holding it in reserve as a quiet, unstated threat? Some of these places have already tested that leverage directly, in ways this video has only briefly touched on so far. Others have held it in reserve for generations, a card never quite played outright, its full value never fully tested against a genuine crisis. Tracing each one individually, in the depth each specific story actually deserves, complete with its own history, its own key moment of realization, and its own unresolved tensions, is exactly where this series goes next, one narrow gate at a time. Here's what stays with me about this story, long after the specific numbers and dates fade into the background. 5 places. A combined width across all 5 choke points measured at their narrowest points that you could probably drive across in a single afternoon if any of them happened to be roads instead of open ocean water. And running through those handful of narrow miles, the overwhelming majority of the oil that fuels the entire global economy, a huge share of the physical goods that fill stores and warehouses on every inhabited continent, and, as the Ever Given demonstrated so vividly across 6 memorable days in 2021, something close to $10 billion a day in trade that the rest of the world simply assumes, almost without thinking about it, will keep moving smoothly and uninterrupted, indefinitely, forever. That's the part of this story genuinely worth carrying forward long after the specific numbers fade from memory. The global economy isn't actually the sprawling, redundant, essentially unstoppable system it can appear to be from a comfortable distance, the way a map covered in dense, crisscrossing shipping lines can make it look at first glance. It's a system that, at its most critical structural junctures, narrows down dramatically to a handful of specific, geographically irreplaceable places on Earth. Places most people couldn't confidently locate on a blank map if asked, controlled by nations whose populations are, in the overwhelming majority of cases, just as invested in keeping global trade flowing smoothly and profitably as anyone downstream who happens to depend on it. Geography quietly built these 5 choke points millions of years before any human being ever thought to ship a single container through them. Whoever happens to control the narrow water at each one today simply inherited a form of leverage that no amount of economic size elsewhere, no amount of accumulated military strength deployed anywhere else on the map can fully offset or meaningfully replace. That's a strange and, in its own way, humbling fact about the modern global economy. For all its complexity, its trillions of dollars in daily transactions, and its impossibly intricate webs of contracts and supply chains, it still ultimately depends on a small handful of physical places behaving exactly as expected, day after day, year after year, largely without anyone outside the shipping industry giving those places a second thought. Understanding this pattern doesn't require alarm, and it doesn't require assuming the worst about any specific government's stated intentions or long-term ambitions. It simply requires recognizing, clearly and without exaggeration, that a genuinely small number of places on this planet, most of them barely a few miles wide at their narrowest and easily overlooked entirely on a standard world map, quietly hold more sway over your daily life, your grocery prices, and the specific products currently sitting in your own home right now than almost any headline you're likely to read this year. The next time a news anchor mentions a shipping delay, a spike in oil prices, or a supply chain disruption somewhere far away, there's a genuine chance it traces back to one of exactly these 5 places, whether or not the report ever bothers to name it directly. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and share it with 5 people who'd actually sit through something like this from start to finish. Leave a comment. Tell me honestly what you thought. And tell me which of these 5 choke points, out of everything covered here, you want us to trace in the deepest possible detail next. Because somewhere on the map, right now, at this exact moment, a few miles of water most people will never visit and could never point to are quietly deciding more about your daily life, your grocery bill, and the products sitting in your own home than almost anything actually reported in the headlines you'll read this week.